Okay, so are you ready to dive deep into Behave by Robert Sapolsky?
Absolutely. It's a fantastic book. Really gets you thinking about, why we are the way we are.
Yeah, it's like he's trying to explain all of human behavior, which is, well, a pretty ambitious goal.
It is, right. But he does a great job of bringing together all this research from evolution to psychology to neuroscience.
So where do we even begin with a deep dive into something this massive?
Well, he throws out this really bold statement right at the start. He says, humans, we're just another animal.
Okay, I can see how that would ruffle some feathers. Is he just trying to be provocative, or does he back it up?
Oh, he totally backs it up. He gives all these examples of how much we share, biologically speaking, with some pretty unexpected creatures.
Like what? Give me an example.
Okay, so you know that stress hormone a fish releases when it's, say, being chased by a bigger fish?
Yeah.
We humans, we produce that exact same hormone when we're stressed out.
No way.
Yeah,
So we're that similar chemically, even to something as different from us as a fish.
pretty much. And it gets even wilder, like the way our neurons fire off signals, the basic communication in our brains.
Yeah.
It turns out it's incredibly close to how it works in, wait for it, brine shrimp.
Brine shrimp. Seriously.
Seriously.
That's both hilarious and kind of humbling.
Right.
But okay, if we're so similar to other animals in all these ways, what is it that makes humans so different? I mean, we're capable of such incredible things, but also, some pretty awful stuff.
Exactly. And that's where Sapolsky makes this really interesting point. He says our capacity for both good and evil, that whole morality thing, it all comes from the same biological roots.
Okay, I'm intrigued, but how does that even work?
To understand that, we got to ditch this old idea that the brain is just like a collection of separate parts, each with its own little job.
Right, it's not like there's a happiness center we can just switch on.
Exactly. It's way more interconnected than that. This complex web of regions that are constantly talking to each other. Like, take the limbic system, for example.
Okay, refresh my memory on that one.
So the limbic system, sometimes called the emotional brain, it's got things like the amygdala and the hippocampus.
The amygdala, that's the part that makes you jump out of your skin when you hear a loud noise.
Right.
All about fear and that fight or flight response.
You got it. But here's the thing. The limbic system doesn't just operate in isolation. It's in this constant back and forth with the frontal cortex.
Yeah.
The frontal cortex, that's the more evolved part of our brain, the one that lets us think ahead, plan, consider consequences, all that good stuff.
So it's like the frontal cortex is trying to keep the emotional limbic system in check.
Exactly. And it's this interplay between the two that makes us, well, us. It's why we're not just running on pure emotion all the time.
Although, let's be honest, it can definitely feel that way sometimes.
Totally. But if our brain is this network, what actually triggers it to, make us act in a certain way?
Right, like what's actually pulling the strings.
Well, Sapolsky, he walks us through this whole cascade of triggers, and it starts with all the stuff we're taking in constantly: sights, sounds, smells, even things we're not even consciously aware of, like subliminal cues.
Wait, subliminal stuff is actually a thing.
Oh, yeah. And they can totally change how we act.
That's kind of creepy when you think
Oh,
about
it
it.
is. And guess what part of the brain is super involved in processing these subliminal cues?
Let me guess. The amygdala.
Bingo. So it's not just about conscious fear. It's picking up on all these subtle signals influencing our behavior in the background.
Okay, but if the amygdala is sending up red flags, even when we don't consciously register a threat,
Mm-hmm.
doesn't the frontal cortex step in and say, hold on, let's think about this?
In theory, yes. But here's the catch. The amygdala, it can be so fast that it basically bypasses the frontal cortex entirely.
And that's how we end up with those split-second decisions that are more about gut instinct than logic.
Exactly. It's like those implicit biases we hear about, those snap judgments we make about people based on, well, things that shouldn't really matter.
Like someone's race or how they're dressed.
Sadly, yes. These biases can be really deeply ingrained, often rooted in fear or this sense of threat, and they can have huge consequences. Sapolsky uses this really tragic case, the Amadou Diallo case, as an example.
Right, that was that awful story of Amadou Diallo, an unarmed black man in New York City who was shot and killed by police officers who mistook his wallet for a gun.
It's just heartbreaking. And it shows how these implicit biases, especially in high-stress situations, can lead to truly devastating outcomes. It's a stark reminder that as complex as our brains are, we are still products of evolution.
And we don't always have as much control as we'd like to think, huh?
Unfortunately, no. We're only human, after all.
That's a sobering thought.
So we were talking about how we don't always have as much control as we think, right? And hormones are a great example of that. They get blamed for a lot.
They do, don't they?
Yeah.
But Sapolsky kind of dismantles some of those myths, right?
Yeah.
Like, especially when it comes to testosterone.
Oh, yeah. He spends a lot of time on testosterone.
So set the record straight. Is it really the aggression hormone everyone makes it out to be?
Not really, no. It's way more nuanced. It doesn't directly cause aggression. Think of it more like this. Imagine your emotions are playing on a stereo system. Testosterone. It's not creating the music, it's just cranking up the volume.
Oh, I like that analogy. So if someone's already prone to anger or aggression, testosterone might amplify it, but it's not the root cause.
Exactly. It's how our biology interacts with our environment. Even small changes in testosterone can have an effect, but only if the right social triggers are there.
There's that nature-nurture dance again.
Always.
But since we're debunking hormone myths, what about oxytocin? Isn't that supposed to be the love hormone, the one that makes us all warm and fuzzy?
Oxytocin, yeah, it gets held up as this magical elixir, but like testosterone, it's not that simple.
Meaning?
Well, it does play a role in social bonding for sure, especially between like romantic partners or parents and children.
Right.
But, and this is important, studies have shown it can also make negative social emotions more intense.
You mean like fear and anxiety? Even aggression?
Yep, all of those. It really depends on the situation.
Wow, so even the love hormone has a dark side.
It does. It all comes back to context, right? Remember those adorable prairie voles? The ones that console each other after a stressful event?
Yeah, they're like the poster animals for empathy.
Right. Well, researchers found that if you block the effects of oxytocin in a specific part of their brains,
Which part?
the anterior cingulate cortex, or ACC for short.
Okay.
So they blocked oxytocin in the ACC, and guess what? The voles completely stopped consoling each other.
No way. So oxytocin needs a little help from the ACC to work its pro-social magic.
Ugh.
It's amazing how much we're learning about all these interactions in the brain.
Yeah.
And speaking of complex interactions, I feel like we have to talk about stress.
We do, because it's way more than just feeling overwhelmed, that's for sure.
Right. And Sapolsky really gets into the weeds on this one.
He does, and one of the most interesting things he talks about is this idea of the inverted U of stress. Basically, it means that a little bit of stress, it can actually be good for you.
Wait, seriously? You're telling me those pre-presentation jitters are doing me a favor?
In a way, yes, because it's your brain and body getting you fired up, ready to perform. A little surge of stress can make you more alert, more focused. It can even boost your memory.
So it's like that feeling of being on when the pressure's on.
Exactly. The problem is when that stress becomes chronic, when it's constant and unrelenting, that's when it starts to backfire.
Because then you're drowning in cortisol.
Exactly. And cortisol is a powerful hormone. Short bursts are fine, even helpful, but long-term exposure, not so much. It can really do a number on your brain and your body.
I've even heard that chronic stress can actually change the physical structure of our brains. Is that true?
It is, and it goes back to this concept called neuroplasticity, which is basically the brain's ability to rewire itself based on our experiences.
So our brains are constantly changing and adapting.
Constantly. And stress plays a big role in that, for better or for worse. Remember the hippocampus we talked about?
Yeah.
The part of the brain that's crucial for forming memories?
Yeah.
Well, chronic stress can actually impair its function.
So not only do you feel lousy when you're chronically stressed, but your brain isn't working as well either.
It's a double whammy.
Yeah.
And it shows just how powerful our experiences, even those negative ones, can be in shaping our brains.
Which kind of makes me think about the teenage brain. Talk about roller coaster.
Right. Sapolsky has a whole section on adolescence in Behave. He explains that teenagers are so impulsive, so sensitive to peer pressure, because that frontal cortex we were just talking about, the one that's supposed to be in charge of decision-making and impulse control, It's still under construction in teenagers.
So, like, they have all the emotional intensity of childhood,
Yeah.
but they don't have all the brain tools yet to manage it.
Exactly. It's like their brains are caught between two worlds, childhood and adulthood.
And then throw in all the hormonal changes of puberty on top of that. No wonder those years can feel so tumultuous.
It's a wild ride for sure. But it's important to remember that adolescence isn't just about drama and bad decisions. This is also a time when the brain is incredibly plastic, incredibly adaptable.
Hey.
It means teenagers have this immense capacity to learn, to make new connections, to really shape who they're going to be.
So it's a time of incredible possibility, too.
Absolutely.
But it seems like no matter what age we are, this nature versus nurture debate always comes up. Is it our genes that determine everything, or is it how we're raised? Where does Sapolsky land on that?
He says flat out, it's always both.
Hmm.
Our genes don't operate in a vacuum. They're constantly interacting with our environment from the moment we're born.
So it's not one or the other, it's this constant interplay.
Exactly. He uses this great example about height.
Okay, how so?
Well, your genes obviously play a role in how tall you are, right?
Right.
But so do a million other things. Your nutrition, stress levels during childhood, even exposure to certain diseases can all have an impact.
So even though we inherit a blueprint from our parents, our environment plays a huge role in how that blueprint actually gets expressed.
Exactly. And he talks about this fascinating study where they took genetically identical mice, so literally clones with the exact same DNA,
Yeah.
and they raised them in totally different lab environments.
Like what kind of different environments?
Well, some of the labs were super stimulating, with lots of toys and opportunities to socialize and explore. Other labs were much more basic, kind of sterile.
So same DNA, totally different upbringings. What happened?
Well, despite having identical genes, the mice raised in these different environments ended up being dramatically different.
Like personality-wise.
Totally. The ones raised in those stimulating environments, they were much more curious and social, even better at learning and remembering things. The mice raised in those more barren cages, they were more anxious and prone to aggression. They even found differences in the brains of these mice, even though their DNA was exactly the same.
That's incredible. So even though they were genetically identical, the environment actually changed how their genes were being expressed.
That's a powerful argument for nurture, if I've ever heard one.
It is. But Sapolsky doesn't stop at just our physical environment, though. He points out that culture is just as powerful in shaping who we are.
Yeah, and it's like everyone's always talking about those big cultural differences these days, like individualistic versus collectivist, East versus West.
Right. It's everywhere you turn.
It is. But Sapolsky, he's like, okay, those are interesting starting points, but let's get more granular here. He says we need to go deeper to really understand how deeply culture influences us.
So it's not just about what country you're from. It's what? Like how those values actually show up in your everyday life.
Exactly. It's everything. How you raise your kids, how you interact with strangers, even, get this, how you think.
Wait, so you're saying our thoughts are culturally programmed too?
To a surprising degree, yeah. Like, he gives this fascinating example. There was this study that looked at different occupational groups within a single region of Turkey. They compared herders to farmers and fishermen.
Okay, so herders versus farmers and fishermen. How's that about culture?
Well, the herders, they lived this more isolated life, right?
Yeah.
While the farmers and fishermen, they were constantly collaborating, depending on each other, much more interconnected. And it turned out that the herders, those more solitary folks, they tended to think in these really absolute terms, focused on things like exact length, strict categories.
Interesting.
Right? But the farmers and fishermen, they were much more tuned in to relationships between things, to relative differences. It was like their professions actually shaped how they saw the world.
Wow. So even within a single culture, our way of life, even our jobs, can influence how we think.
It's wild, right?
Kind of profound when you think about it. Like how much of who we are is really us versus shaped by all these external forces swirling around us.
It's the big question, isn't it? And Sapolsky, he wants us to appreciate how powerful culture is, but also to remember that it's not static. Cultures are always changing, mixing, sometimes clashing, and our brains are changing right along with them.
It's like this constant dance between our biology, our environment, our experiences. And speaking of a complex dance, I know Sapolsky talks a lot about this idea of us versus them.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one for him. And it's not just about, like, rooting for your favorite sports team, you know?
Yeah.
He's really digging into the neurobiology of how we form these groups.
And what do you find?
Well, it turns out our brains, they're kind of hardwired to categorize people into us and them groups, and it happens so fast, like before we've even had time to think about it consciously.
So it's like our amygdala is on high alert, scanning for safe versus threat, even when there's no real danger.
Exactly. Our brains are constantly trying to figure out who's with us and who's against us. And you know what? Sometimes that instinct can be really useful. Like, if you're facing a real threat, that quick categorization can save your life.
Right. Like back in the day when we were dodging saber-toothed tigers.
But it seems like these days, those us and them instincts can be pretty destructive.
They can. And Sapolsky talks about how easily those biases can be activated, even when we don't realize it's happening. There was this one study where they flashed images of faces on a screen.
Faces. Okay.
But here's the thing. They flashed them for a fraction of a second, like so fast that people couldn't even consciously process what they were seeing.
Subliminal messaging, but with faces.
Exactly. And even those super quick, unconscious glimpses of faces from different racial groups, they were enough to activate the amygdala in the participants' brains. So, like, our brains are primed for different equals potential danger, even when we know intellectually that that's not true.
It's like that old wiring is still there, lurking beneath the surface. And that's why it's so important to be aware of it, to consciously challenge those biases whenever we can.
Because we're not helpless against these instincts, are we?
Exactly. Sapolsky's big on this point. Understanding our biology, it's not about excusing bad behavior, it's about empowering us to make better choices.
So it's not all doom and gloom. We can actually learn to manage these us and them instincts.
We can. It's about recognizing those triggers, understanding the nuances. Like Sapolsky points out that this tendency to form groups, it's not inherently a bad thing, right? It's part of what allows us to connect with others, to build communities, to feel like we belong.
Right. It's like that old saying, it's all about balance.
Exactly. It's about context, about being aware of the forces that are shaping our behavior so we can make more conscious choices.
So speaking of making choices, I know Sapolsky dives into morality in Behave. What's his take on how we develop a sense of right and wrong?
It's interesting. He really challenges this assumption that we're these perfectly rational beings who make moral decisions based on logic alone.
Because we're not.
Not even close. Emotions play a huge role. Like, we might feel disgusted by something, and then our brains try to rationalize that disgust as a moral judgment.
So it's like our gut feelings are driving the bus and our brains are just trying to keep up.
Sometimes, yeah. He talks about this part of the brain called the insula, which is involved in both our sense of disgust and our moral judgments.
So when something feels off to us, morally speaking, our insula is firing off.
It can be, and it highlights how much of our morality is tied to these deep-seated visceral reactions. It's not always pretty, but it's part of what makes us human.
It's a lot to wrap our heads around, that's for sure. We've covered so much ground today: evolution, hormones, that incredible interconnected brain of ours. But if you had to pick one big takeaway from Behave, what would it be?
That's a tough one. I think, for me, it boils down to this. We are incredibly complex creatures, capable of both great good and great harm. And understanding how our brains work, how all these different factors, our genes, our environment, our experiences, come together to shape our behavior. It's not about excusing bad behavior. It's about recognizing our potential and using that knowledge to make more conscious, compassionate choices.
I love that. It's a call to action for all of us, really. So to everyone listening, the next time you're wrestling with a tough decision or just trying to make sense of this crazy world, remember, we're all in this together. Our brains might be wired for some pretty wild stuff, but we also have this incredible capacity for change, for growth, for connection. Choose wisely.
Beautifully said. And for anyone who wants to dive even deeper into these ideas, definitely check out Behave. It's a fascinating read.
Couldn't agree more. This deep dive has given us a lot to think about. Until next time, keep exploring and keep asking those big questions about what makes us human.